So Jonathan Holloway is a very distinguished professor of African American Studies, History, and American Studies at Yale University, where he also received his PhD in 1995. He's also in his first year as chair of the Department of African American Studies. He has a lot of connections to the Bunch Center. As some of you who know his work know, he's the author of Confronting the Veil, Abram Harris Jr., E. Franklin Frazier, and Ralph Bunche, 1919-1941, which in my view is the best intellectual history of Bunche's early radical years, but more importantly, it's this extraordinary book that situates these three intellectuals at Howell University in the interwar years, who were basically pushing for a radical kind of social democracy, in critiquing race and understanding the importance of racism as a critique. And in fact, if you pay attention to what he's saying, Howard University is the center of social science in the United States at the time. It's not the University of Chicago, see? And you got to read his book to know that, so you got to check that out. He's also, again, another Bunche connection. He edited A Brief and Tentative Analysis of Negro Leadership, which was Bunche's manuscript in the papers here at UCLA, which I actually saw that manuscript when I was doing my own research and said, wow, someone should publish this book. And this is the man who did it, you know. He co-edited with another UCLA PhD, by the way, someone I went to school with, Ben Heppel, a book called Black Scholars on the Line, Race, Social Science, and American Thought in the 20th Century, which is a wonderful collection of primary sources, readings by some of the key intellectual figures dealing with questions of social science and race. He's currently editing a new version of W. B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk, which should be out this year, right? Is that coming? Or this year or sometime. But we're here to listen to him talk about this wonderful book called Jim Crow Wisdom, Memory, and Identity in Black America Since 1940. I'm not going to say anything else because our time is short. I'll let him talk about the book, but I just have to say that it touched me personally in some ways because although we're very different people, he's tall, I'm short. I felt like the path that he took in his life and understanding some of these questions of Jim Crow wisdom are things that I resonated and identified right away because they're things that I've seen and experienced myself. And in some ways, a lot of us have, but they're things that we don't talk about. And that's what really moved me in many ways. And I said, as soon as I read it, I wrote him, I said, Jonathan, you need to come to UCLA to talk about this book. So he's here. Thank you.
I've got, forgot to bring a remote for my laptop, so I'll be going back and forth a little bit. But I do want to start. It's great to be here. You know, Robin mentioned his email. Robin, as you all know, is very understated. And he mentioned an email that he wrote to me one morning. I remember that morning crystal clear. And I have a bad habit since I run one of Yale's residential colleges. A very unhealthy habit I have is waking up, taking the phone, the first thing to do is check the email, hoping nothing's happened. And it was summertime, there's no reason to do this. And I pick up my phone and check email, and there's a message from, I think it didn't come up as Robin Kelly, but Kelly Martin. I was just very confused, it's very early. And the subject line had me confused, you know, something about the book. I'm like, wait, I don't know what's going on. And then he shared with me this really long, beautiful, generous journey that he went on in thinking of the book and the way in which so many things parallel in our lives. And then I was thinking, well, what am I going to show today or talk about today? And I thought I would do the epilogue of the book, decided not to. And the reason I wanted to do the epilogue is it allowed me to actually have a rational reason to show this picture. And this is a quote from the epilogue of the book deals with my journey to Ghana. And that's good, Professor Kelly. And I won't go into longer detail there, but that's a quote from him. Not bored, but somber. Not moved, but contemplative. A very complex space, I mean, to say the least. And he did tell me, you know, you should have, and he sent this picture, I'm like, I had the same, I mean, almost the exact same picture. It basically, there's like a star on the ground, you stand on it, and the tour guide takes your picture right there. And he said, oh, you should have had that in the book. And the reason he mentioned that is because the book is a quite personal book, in the sense that it travels between third person, where historians are allowed to talk and write, to the first person, where we aren't allowed to talk and write. I mean, we are essentially, if we had that impulse in grad school, it's trained out of us right away. Never use the first person. And writing a book on memory, I planned to write it exclusively in the third person. But after I kept running into things that, like, wait, that story of Langston Hughes from 1944, that's the same story my father related from something in 1955. That thing that happened to so-and-so forth in 1960, that happened to my brother in 1980. Wait, that happened to me in 1990. Things I really hadn't thought much about or really hadn't pulled together. Then I finally gave myself permission to write in the first person. And so the book became, for me at first, a reckless journey of switching between third and first person. And then it actually sort of all made sense, that it had to be that way. I can't imagine the book existing any other way. So I say that to help you understand our correspondence that one early morning. I think you were in Italy at the time or something? Yeah. I was in Connecticut, not nearly as fancy. But I wanted to share that with you so you understand some of the voice shifts you're going to hear in this reading from the 5th chapter of the book. No, that's not right. The final chapter of the book. But let me begin with a poem. And it's actually the first word you see in the book proper. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories. And I keep on remembering mine. It's by Lucille Clifton, why some people be mad at me sometimes. And I always start my talks on this book with this poem. One, because the backstory is amazing. Lucille Clifton was the poet laureate in the state of Maryland, and she was asked by some public affairs kinds of officials to write a poem celebrating, I think it might have been the sesquicentennial of Maryland's history, and the theme of that sesquicentennial is My Happy Colonial Days. And Lucille Clifton, African-American woman, said, well, they weren't happy for everybody. And so she wrote this poem instead, which they did not appreciate. And she went writing a poem that they used, actually I don't know what poem that is, but she kept this one. I think this is one of the more powerful poems, at least for a project on memory. I also start my talks with this because it shows you the power of poetry. That's a 5-line poem that captures 288 pages of my book. Right there. That's it. So I'm going to do a reading today from the last third of the final chapter of the book, and we're coming into the discussion then with a lot of things already on the table. The core ideas, though, are pretty straightforward. I'm concerned with the significance of heritage tourism, the selling and consumption of how people understand their history. I'm interested in that as a phenomenon when the material around which all this consumption is happening is filled with humor, horror and degradation. It's the selling of horror. First part of this talk is called Making a Museum. The sky was spotless as I made my way through what seemed to be a gentrifying arts district of Memphis. I wasn't far from my destination, but I already was finding it difficult to imagine a different era, since it was clear that so much had been cleaned up in the last handful of years. Even the trolley trundling past didn't look authentically old, since it was so clearly new. The place even verged on being antiseptic. The sidewalks seemed devoid of any foot traffic. Granted, it was a mid-morning weekday in late summer, it is likely the neighborhood's character changed in the evening when the bistros and restaurants began to fill up for happy hours, and then again on the weekend when the city's farmers market, located just around the corner, opened for business. I wasn't there, however, to go on a pub crawl or shop for local produce. Where was the museum? I should be close by. And then one block down, I saw it. Not the museum, but the hotel. For those who study the African American past, and likely for most people who pay even the slightest bit of attention during Black History Month or in their high school social science study units, you could not help but notice the sign. It seems silly to say, but it looked just like it did in the photographs. Granted, there wasn't a crowd of men frozen on the balcony pointing across the street where James Earl Ray fired his rifle, but they didn't need to be there to get the effect of the moment. I literally gasped and my stomach dropped. This was the Lorraine Hotel. Of course, the museum was also the hotel, but the stagecraft of the museum was such, even the vehicles parked immediately in front of the hotel were vintage vehicles similar to those that were in the parking lot when King was murdered. The stagecraft of the museum was such that when you pulled up to the front of the museum, the only thing you could process was the fact that you were staring at the hotel where King spent his final moments, the hotel from all of the textbooks and documentaries, the hotel you knew even though you had never before stepped foot in the hotel, much less Memphis. Opened in the 1920s as the Windsor Hotel, the building was purchased and renamed by Walter and Louis Bailey in 1945. The Lorraine Hotel became known for its high-profile guests who were performing a block away on Beale Street, the heart of Memphis's black community and the incubator of so many of the country's blues performers. After the shock of King's murder, and it literally was a shock, as co-owner Louis Bailey died of a heart attack after running out into the parking lot and seeing King murdered. The subsequent years of urban decline and then a post-segregated renewal that meant that black visitors could stay in other, more modern facilities. The Lorraine Hotel faced foreclosure in 1982. It became a long-term, low-income apartment complex when local activists and business leaders came together to purchase the space at auction with the intention of turning it into a civil rights museum. The museum opened in September 1991. The museum was welcomed and praised, but not universally so. Jacqueline Smith, a longtime resident of the Lorraine, and some accounts she's listed as a cleaning person who happened to also have a room at the facility. Jacqueline Smith, a longtime resident of the Lorraine, when it had become a low-income boarding house, refused to leave the building when it was sold and being prepared for the renovation that would convert it into the National Civil Rights Museum. Smith stayed in her room after other residents had moved out, after the court order declared she needed to vacate, and after her water and heat were shut off. Finally, on March 2nd, 1988, 2 months into her illegal occupancy, 4 Shelby County deputies forced open the door to her room and carried her and her belongings out to the curb. When she first announced in January that she would not leave despite the court order, Smith said, "Dr. King would have wanted me to stay here. He said he didn't want any memorial, but he wanted to help the poor." On the morning of her eviction, a sobbing Smith declared that she had no place to go. "This is wrong. You people are making a mistake." Smith sat on the sidewalk among her belongings and refused to leave. Over 2 years later, Smith was in the same spot when another court order forced her to move. This time she was accused of trespassing on a construction site. After she ignored the order, her possessions were placed in the street and she was moved while sitting in her lawn chair to the sidewalk opposite the museum. When asked by a reporter for the Associated Press why she was opposed to the museum, Smith reasserted her sense that King wanted to serve the poor. And that is exactly what the Lorraine was doing when it was closed and she was evicted. For Smith, the Lorraine and King's legacy were being desecrated. "This sacred ground is being exploited," she said. Over 20 years have passed since this second forced move. Jacqueline Smith is still there. Now this is an image this is from 19 years of her protest. And that, the wheel well, that's her there. You can't really see her in the wheel well. And she has a banner up. When I went there, it was 23 years. 224 days of her protest. Smith maintains this protest vigil, urging visitors approaching the museum not to go inside. The museum and the neighborhood gentrification that has accompanied it, she avers, has destroyed the area by making it unaffordable for long-term residents like herself. The neighborhood was now reserved for tourists. It was turning into Disneyland. Even in Memphis's unrelenting late summer sun, Smith stands at her corner opposite the museum, behind 2 tables filled with copies of newspaper articles relating to her eviction. In front of one of the tables is a banner with a large counter tracking the years and days since, quote, "I began my personal protest to speak on behalf of the disadvantaged and displaced." Beneath the statement is a website where the tourists, who likely hadn't bargained on this being part of the excursion, I certainly didn't when I walked up, can go to learn more about Smith's efforts. Smith's website, fulfilldadream.net, presents a timeline of King's life, but largely focuses on Smith's arrest and vigil and the museum's short-sightedness and crass devotion to the tourist's dollar. The site does not mince words. The National Civil Rights Museum has, from day one, considered the ghoulish needs of the mass tourist market greater than the real need to educate and inform. In many places throughout the site, there are 9 different portals on the website with many pages following each portal link. It's actually bigger than the museum's website. Smith invokes religious language and equates the museum's work as a desecration of a sacred space. Indeed, she faults the entire project for how it goes about the work of recording civil rights history, wondering aloud if this is the best use of the nation's memory. With one exception, the museum does not recognize Smith or her protest. It invests in the seriousness and integrity of its educational work and is equally determined to honor King and his legacy as it is telling the largest story of civil rights and human rights struggles in the United States and beyond. The museum does acknowledge Smith's presence, however. On the frequently asked questions page for the museum's website, you will find the following FAQ number 8 of 12. Who is the protester outside? Her name is Jacqueline Smith, and she has protested the museum since the ground was broken in 1987, but she's never been inside the museum. Even though the museum recognizes Smith's protest, if only barely, her vigil tells us something valuable about the production of history, the sanctification of certain experiences over others, and the interplay between an individual and an institution. Here, a single person with a particular set of memories and a determination to remember a figure of such importance like King in a specific way, finds herself facing an institution with a public commitment to remembrance that has become this individual's horror. Making heritage. By any account, the Southern heritage tourism trade is booming as cities and states increasingly recognize the consumptive power of the black dollar. The attention to this market is intense. In 2005, a museum a year was opening in Montgomery, Alabama. That same year, the Alabama Bureau of Tourism and Travel released the Alabama Civil Rights Trail, a 24-page booklet guiding tourists to the state's main sites of racial shame and remembrance. Indeed, Alabama may have been on the leading edge of state-sponsored efforts to remember the civil rights past. In 1983, it was the first state to distribute a Black Heritage Guide. Currently, the Alabama Civil Rights Trail is one of 16 state trails featured on the Sweet Home Alabama website. From this site, you can also navigate to, among other things, the Food and Wine Trail, the Hank Williams Trail, the Civil War Trail, and the West Alabama Hunting and Fishing Trail. In the 30 years since Alabama produced its first Black Heritage Guide, African American heritage trails are found now throughout the country. They predominate in the southeast, but are also to be found in as far north as Boston and Martha's Vineyard. The jewel in the crown of these trails is the brand new Louisiana African American Heritage Trail. The official history of the Louisiana African American experience debuted in February of 2009. It is in your pocket and at your fingertip, literally. A very basic internet search will take you to the website for the state of Louisiana's African American Heritage Trail, excuse me, a site titled A Story Like No Other. See it at the very top of the screen there. After following a few links, you can download the Like No Other smartphone app. It's on my phone right here. And you are ready to explore Louisiana's rich Black history. This is just a screen grab. However, before you start using the app to browse, and it is actually a fabulous app. I just want to, I'll endorse that. Before you start using the app to browse various heritage sites, read capsule histories of these sites, bookmark them in a separate file, and then map them in order to create a personalized itinerary, two performers set the stage for understanding and appreciating the unique nature of Black Louisiana's heritage. When you navigate to a story like no other, a splash page opens with a shot of a lonesome, unpaved country road at some point in the early fall or late winter. Two musicians amble in from the left side of the screen, the laconic and swaying pace keeping time with the thrum of crickets or cicadas hidden among the brown grasses and thicket of trees covered with Spanish moss in the distance. While the harmonica player calls us to attention with his keening yet comfortable playing, the guitar sings.
A government like no other, a millionaire like no other, a boy like no other, and a coach like no other, in the music, sweet music, music like no other. When it comes to soul food, my brother, like no other. A story, yes, a story like no other.
A governor like no other, a millionaire like no other, a boycott like no other, and a coach like no other, and the music, sweet music, music like no other. When it comes to soul food, my brother, it's like no other. It's a story, yes, a story like no other. While the guitar player sings, performing in blissful rapture, a montage of images scrolls along the right side of the screen. The viewer sees politician, PBS pinchback, millionaire Madam C.J. Walker, scenes from the 1953 Baton Rouge bus boycott, legendary college football coach Eddie Robinson, musicians playing in a public square, and soul food matriarch Leah Chase. In short, the introduction is all about celebration and excellence. There's nothing wrong or even offensive about the intros. In fact, they make perfect and compelling sense in the context of travel tourism. But as the tourist begins to navigate through the website or the smartphone app and assembles the planned route to the state, what kinds of history will the tourist encounter? Will the memories of the long neglected Black voice be experienced, or will some state-sponsored version of history rule the day? Will there even be a distinction between the two? Or will the cherished narratives of the Louisiana past be destroyed in order to satisfy a present-day political agenda? The stakes are considerable. Though conceived by public historians who were dedicated to getting the story right, the Louisiana African American Heritage Trail was brought to fruition because of the financial boom that would accompany it. The documents about this are very pointed. This is a billion-dollar initiative. Even though political market economies justify the trail's creation, the public historians who conceived of Louisiana's African American Heritage Trail remained committed to reconstructing the African American experience as accurately as possible. As they began to develop their plan for the trail, they decided to focus upon 5 core themes: plantation life, the history of Louisiana's free people of color, the Civil War and Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the struggle for civil rights. Organizing Blacks' experiences through these themes made natural sense given the prominent role these events, places, or people played in Louisiana. But the historians remained concerned about how to excavate, literally and figuratively, the African American past when so much of it had been ignored or silenced. With this challenge in mind, they set out to find those sites throughout Louisiana that were telling the state's history faithfully. They had mixed success. There were those places like the River Road Museum, a small, essentially one-person operation that presented the history of African Americans in Donaldsonville, a key waypoint along the Mississippi River in sugarcane country. The River Road Museum survived on a shoestring budget while seeking support from the state government and the National Park Service for, among other things, its community gardens that simultaneously recreated what slaves would have planted around their cabins to supplement their meager rations and provided produce for the local present-day population. The suggested donation inside the museum door is $5. The Heritage Trail historians also found plantations that catered to a paying tourist economy that were slow, if not flat-out resistant, to incorporating slavery and its horrors into the site's narratives. Oak Alley Plantation explained its resistance to unsettling narratives in romantic and financial terms. According to historian Jessica Adams, Oak Alley owner Zeb Mayhew believes, quoting here, "Oak Alley visitors, for the most part, are looking for a Gone with the Wind brand of fantasy. They come for the hoop skirts, the grandeur, and the elegance." This kind of attitude greatly frustrated the state historians who were looking for sites that were prepared to deal with a fuller historical narrative instead of a fantasy. I had never been to a plantation before. Visiting relics of a, quote, simpler era never appealed to me. My reluctance was predictable, of course, as anyone who isn't a romantic about the antebellum South would understand. But here I was on the Evergreen Plantation, a major stop in the Louisiana African American Heritage Trail. About a dozen of us had gathered for the walking tour. If I had to guess, most people were there to see the big house. I was interested in that as well, but I was mainly there to see the other buildings. It so happens that the Evergreen Plantation is the largest collection of original buildings from the era of antebellum plantation farming, over 35 buildings in fact. The big house, the gardens, the pitch and air, all of these places were interesting or lovely, but more so as a collection of still life structural settings. The kitchen, however, was mesmerizing. Not for the 3 shelves of darky collectibles, manly salt shakers and such, that had no relationship to the antebellum past but were carefully displayed all the same, but for the way the tour guide explained the daily obligations of the slaves who fixed the meals for the residents in the big house. The ghosts began to arrive at that moment, when the guide demonstrated how the heavy pots would rest over the burning wood, how the cooks would use long iron rods to manipulate these pots, how they rose every day, day in and day out, to sustain those who shackled their lives. I was dumbfounded, though, when we moved toward the slave cabins. There they were, ominously silent, down a haunted alley of oak trees. Absolutely still, waiting for us. Much to my surprise, I was very hesitant to go down that path. I felt I was trespassing. I was going where I did not belong. But I also admit to being confused because these weren't my people. My people were from North Carolina and Virginia. They weren't from southern Louisiana. The presence of the figurative and psychological connection, however, could not be denied. These were my people. History told me as much, even though history also told me that reducing a radically diverse population into a people was intellectually lazy. Nevertheless, before I walked up to the steps to the first slave cabin, I silently apologized for paying $20 to buy a ticket to see the plantation and to pay for the upkeep of the big house. I apologized to all of them. Henry White, Apollon, Ben Lewis, Joshua, John, Edmund, Tom Brown, Manuel, Sterling, Crouch, Moses, Fleming, Alfred, Robert, Terry, George, Benjamin Harrison, Nelson, Baptiste, Abraham, Ambrose, Squire, Aaron, Jackson, Anderson, Tom, Henry, Ben, Jean-Pierre, Joe, Pierre, Linhen, Rasul, Suzanne, Genevieve, Fanny, Chloe, Dunca, Isabel, Hector, Evelyn, Will, Racine, Clara, Jacques, Jermaine, Alexis, and 2 children unnamed, all of whom are listed as property. Considering the distant silence that accompanied the displayed porcelain grotesqueries in the kitchen, the cost per person of maintaining the big house, which was actually still private property and occupied in the off-season, the fact that I was the only black person on the tour, and that some of our group arrived as part of a day-long private bus tour moving from one plantation to another, I found myself taking a deep breath, trying to gird myself for whatever whitewashed narrative the tour guide would offer about the slave cabins. The guide, however, surprised me. "This is hallowed ground," she said. "We don't know enough about the people who worked this land and who lived in these cabins. We do know, however, that they were skilled farmers and craftsmen, and they built everything that we have seen today." What I found to be remarkable in that moment, as it turns out, was a noted shift in the narrative a visitor to Evergreen would have heard just a few years earlier. Then visitors to Evergreen would have still seen the slave cabins, but the tour's focus would have been entirely on the plantation house and the other white-occupied spaces. The kitchen, now a site where one learns how slaves fed the plantation, was then merely the place where the owner hosted dinner parties. Granted, the many figurines remain. But one can imagine they played a more interactive role during the dinner parties than in their perched gargoyle-like silence one finds today. My tour guide didn't even reference them at all. There's no doubting that visitors still come to Evergreen primarily to see the plantation house, and it is likely that they may see the slave cabins as something more akin to spectacle than a site of violent subjugation and loss. The tour guide's changing narrative, however, is a reflection of an evolving sensibility about how to tell stories about the black past. But telling a new story about an old place was not a simple matter of writing a new script based upon new interpretations. At Baton Rouge's Magnolia Mound plantation, for example, curators have been chipping away at older, more traditional narratives that focus their attention on the plantation house. As late as 1999, for example, tour guides at the Magnolia Mound plantation declared that the site did not have any records about the slaves who had worked on the plantation. And so I had to develop a narrative about the Magnolia Mound slaves based on secondary literature about Louisiana sugarcane plantation slave systems. 10 years later, and under the guidance of a new manager, who also happened to be a trained archaeologist, pursuing a more nuanced engagement with the past, the Magnolia Mound plantation script had been aggressively rewritten. Previously, visitors to the site only had a structured tour of the plantation house and the kitchen house. The rest of the outside grounds were open to visitors but without curatorial guidance. In the new Magnolia Mound script, slaves' presence is palpable throughout the tour. Every room in the big house, for example, was a site where free and slave interacted. The tour now continued outside of the plantation house, and the slave cabin was incorporated into the broader narratives about life on the plantation. Archaeological digs had unearthed an entire narrative about how slaves lived their life in Magnolia Mound. Furthermore, extensive genealogical research projects at the turn of the century century revealed that there were extensive records about the enslaved people who lived at Magnolia Mound. Now, tour guides could talk about Josephine, Bathsheba, Fanny, Dick, Harry, and another 45 slaves who lived in 16 cabins in the slave quarters. This did not mean that the interpretive challenges had been surmounted, nor could they ever be. In truth, the difficult work was only just beginning. Now that Magnolia Mound's enslaved population had names, and now that the curators knew how they lived, the curators' commitment to understanding and projecting the story of Magnolia Mound only intensified. Curators made sure to incorporate the restored slave cabin into the tour, but also made sure that they framed the cabin in a particular way. In a lesson plan targeting students anywhere from 3rd to 12th grade, the opening line of the tour is a series called A Remembrance. We are about to enter the slave cabin, so we need to be respectful. This is a real slave cabin. What does real mean? People lived here, not fake, non-fiction. No joking or wisecracks inside. Another serious matter curators continue to struggle with is the fact that Magnolia Mound, now a 16-acre site, used to encompass 950 acres. The size of the site isn't so much a problem, but the research staff is now certain that the private homes abutting the property, nearest to the restored slave cabin, also happen to be built upon slaves' unmarked graves. Given the fact that Louisiana's African American Heritage Trail includes many other plantations, there is no doubt that unmarked graves exist elsewhere in the tourist trail. However, due to the expansion of the inner ring of Baton Rouge suburbs, Magnolia Mound now appears as if it were built into the neighborhood instead of the other way around. That a suburban life is perched above unmarked graves is a silent grotesquerie that Magnolia Mound's curators will never be able to address unless they start buying up rows of currently occupied houses, something that is unlikely to ever happen. Perhaps the most powerful side of mortal anonymity, however, is found on the edge of downtown New Orleans in Treme, the city's 6th ward. Often referred to as the long-time or historic home to New Orleans' black populations, there are several stops on the Heritage Trail within blocks of each other. The first-rate New Orleans African American Museum is near to Congo Square and Louis Armstrong Park. Between the two is St. Augustine Church, one of the oldest churches in North America, serving a largely black Catholic congregation. The history of the church itself is impressive, as it speaks to the unique relationship between blacks, Creoles, and whites in a part of the city that has been the economic, social, and cultural home to generations of blacks. But it is a small memorial that is outside the church that speaks in utter silence to the heart of loss and trauma that undergirds so much of the history that tourists experience on the Heritage Trail. At first glance, the memorial looks like a small garden with a curious set of crosses planted in it. But upon closer inspection, a powerful force is at work. There are multiple small crosses of various size and design planted along the tropical grasses. Leaning over them is a massive cross. It leans at a 45-degree angle and appears to have been made out of a ship's anchor chain. Tangled in this cross, this chain, are half a dozen slave shackles, some intact, some broken. This is the site of the tomb of the unknown slave. Dedicated on October 30, 2004, the St. Augustine community created this site to honor the memory of the nameless, faceless, turfless Africans who died in Treme. More than this, however, the shrine is a call to remember all slaves who lie buried in unmarked graves. The tomb's memorial plaque, we can see the edge of it on this picture. The tomb's memorial plaque acknowledges that the tomb tells a story that is as boundless as its subjects are nameless. Unquote. There is no doubt that the campus of St. Augustine Church sits astride the blood, sweat, tears, and some of the mortal remains of unknown slaves from Africa and local American Indian slaves. In other words, the tomb of the unknown slave is a constant reminder that we are walking on holy ground. Thus, we cannot consecrate this tomb because it is already consecrated by many slaves. I'm okay. I'll make it through. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. In other words, the tomb of the unknown slave is a constant reminder that we are walking on holy ground. Thus, we cannot consecrate this tomb because it is already consecrated by many slaves in glorious deaths bereft of any acknowledgement, dignity, or respect. As a site of historical performance, the tomb of the unknown slave is a powerful marker of loss, absence, injustice, and cruelty. Although based on historical fact, it is in the end a figurative assertion, and it is likely because of this that it does not elicit the tendentious commentary. Oops, I just referenced something that's much earlier in the chapter to read to you. People don't get worked up about it. Further, the memorial is not a national shrine like Williamsburg, again earlier in the chapter, but merely placed outside an actual shrine in a black neighborhood. One that, given the sultry New Orleans air, is too far removed from most tourists. Perhaps it was for all these reasons, the shrine's figurative symbolism, its blackness, its distance, that the tomb of the unknown slave was allowed to stand as a silent sentinel over a racial horror that is as boundless and timeless, even as it also happens to be stop number 2 in a story like no other. Third and final section, making a memory. The haunting absence to which the tomb alludes echoes the central themes found in Toni Morrison's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Beloved. Morrison's masterpiece, a wrenching story of a self-emancipated woman's struggle to find peace for herself and her family, is a meditation on the deadening effects of memory. Too much memory of some types, and not nearly enough of others. In Beloved, we learn about Sethe, the book's central character, and successful efforts to secure her children's escape from slavery and then her own. Once free, Sethe is haunted by the possibility of being captured and returned to her abusive owner. When he does find her and sends a crew to capture her and her children, she is overwhelmed by her memories as a slave and attempts to murder her 2 sons, a toddling daughter and an infant. This, she believed, was an expression of true love. Their death would mean avoiding the trauma of a life not worth living. She manages to kill the toddler, but spends the rest of her life haunted by her act of true love, as well as the ghost that returns to consume her and this love. Beloved offers a polyphony of voices, narrating their memories of Sethe, her actions, and their pasts as slaves. It is a book riven with horror, much of it too powerful to be recalled. Rape for sport and for breeding, physical and psychological assaults of all manner, lynching, and the terror of recognizing that virtually no white people believe that blacks have the capacity for human complexity. In the book's closing pages, a chorus of narrators affirm the trauma of those memories when they speak to the breadth and depth of Sethe's lived nightmare and their own, saying, it was not a story to pass on, and adding, remembering seemed unwise. In animating the inner lives that white people believe that blacks do not possess, Morrison made the narration of absence an assertion of memory. Blacks had a past, Beloved declares. It may well have been a horrific past, but it existed and could therefore be named. In 1988, the Universal Unitarian Association honored Morrison with the Frederick G. Melcher Book Award for her accomplishments in Beloved. In her acceptance speech, she explained why she was compelled to write Beloved. She says, there is no place, this is in 1988, there is no place you or I can go to think about or not think about, to summon the presences of, or recollect the absences of slaves. Nothing that reminds us of the ones who made the journey and of those who did make it. There is no suitable memorial or plaque or wreath or wall or park or skyscraper lobby. There's no 300-foot tower. There's no small bench by the road. There's not even a tree scored, an initial that I can visit or you can visit in Charleston or Savannah or New York or Providence or better still, on the banks of the Mississippi. And because such a place doesn't exist that I know of, the book had to. Morrison continued, with hindsight, she saw Beloved's concluding pages, those that declared in different ways that the African-American past, as embodied in Sethe's story, was unwise to remember. She continued with hindsight that this was actually a call to do the opposite. I think I was pleading, she said, for that wall or that bench or that tower or that tree when I wrote those final words. Accepting Morrison's own assessment of her work, the entire novel needs to be understood as an act of authorization, one that said a memory existed in the void, and that it was time for everyone to reconcile with the past. To be sure, this was quite a different reconciliation than the stories of universalist triumph that one finds in the Civil Rights Travel Guides that I didn't tell you about, but I left in the sentence here, but it was still a call to come to terms with the horrors that haunted the African-American past. When the Toni Morrison Society was established in 1993, it heeded Morrison's declaration and adopted a bench by the road as the group's motto. The Society also heard Morrison's plea in her acceptance speech as a call to action and started the Bench by the Road project. The project sought to install permanent benches in locations that were important but unmarked sites related to the African-American past. Although museums and monuments were opened or consecrated in intervening years, the Morrison Society understood that there remained ample room for further discussions about the absences, traumas, and to use Sethe's own construction, rememories in the American narrative. The benches could do some of this work. In 2008, the first bench was installed at Fort Moultrie in Sullivan's Island, South Carolina. Over 300 people, including Morrison, members of the Morrison Society, representatives from the National Park Service, and local Charlestonians attended. During the installation ceremony, Morrison and Tomlin Polite threw a memorial wreath into the Atlantic Ocean. Afterward, Polite, a seventh-generation descendant of a 10-year-old girl stolen from Sierra Leone in 1756, who was in quarantine with other Africans in the Sullivan Island pest houses before being sold, declared that a circle closed when they installed that first bench, remembered and thereby honored the millions of unknowable people who passed through Sullivan Island. There are now 6 such benches with plans for 14 more. It is far too early to know if they will become the focus of important tourist destinations like King's Hotel Room at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. It is also too early to know if they will be incorporated into the growing number of civil rights tourist guides, or if they will merit attention in various electronic state heritage tourism websites and smartphone apps. What is already clear, however, is that their very presence is a declaration that memory and horror shape the narrative that gives meaning to the African American present. Thank you.
For questions?
Questions or comments? Happy to have them.
I know you mentioned that it's very hard to find out the story of the slaves that lived on the plantations.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you had any advice how to go about that if one was to do that.
Things are changing really rapidly. In terms of that, they're not on plantations, but Gwendolyn Midlow Hall. I can't remember how many years ago now. I want to say a decade roughly. Did this incredible work that almost blinded her, literally. Going through ships' manifests and tracking cargo, essentially. Manifests people thought were unreadable. And she actually decoded them and has sort of opened up a whole treasure trove of research opportunities to track movement. Okay, and there's other people who are doing that, they're building off of that work. It's really a sort of generative project of hers. Now, when it comes to actual life on the plantation, you have books that, like Walter Johnson's, the first one,
Soul by Soul.
Soul by Soul, thank you. Life Inside the New Orleans Slave Market, something like that. That does really interesting work and I don't mean this in a denigrating way at all, in creative interpretation and trying to figure out what day-to-day life might have been for people who were enslaved. So if you look to his book, you get a certain kind of methodology. That people take issue with. I think it's fabulous, but so there's a way that you can follow what Walter Johnson does to sort of refashion life. Now, so we've gone from ships to slave market now to the plantation. The most important thing I mentioned about what was happening in Magnolia Mound is that the curator the manager came to the site was an archaeologist. That was the most important thing. Before him in Williamsburg, colonial Williamsburg, where people had, since the 70s, in the wake of the Alex Haley Roots phenomenon, people discovering their African past, their usually fictionalized African past. People in Williamsburg are saying, over half the population was black in Williamsburg. We know that. And people said, well, there's no records, well, people started, as they were doing renovation work or building, I can't remember if they were building a road or something, there was this whole just stuff. They didn't know what it was, just bottles and ceramics. They thought it was like a garbage heap from the colonial era. And someone who was a cultural anthropologist, I think, came across like, wait a second, that is not what this is. By knowing about cultural practice that had survived the Middle Passage, like this, where these are laid out, these kinds of things is what you would find in front of the house of someone who was a medicine person. And they basically someone who was trained to see the thing right in front of them. Start seeing, it's like all of a sudden, if you're, well, I know LA's hard to see stars at night, but imagine you're on a clear night and you start looking to see a few stars, and the more you just sit, you see more stars. All of a sudden you realize, especially if you go to a darker place, all that is out there is stars. It's like all around you. This is what they found in colonial Williamsburg. The archaeological record of African American presence was everywhere. People didn't know what it was. They either didn't know what it was, or didn't know what they were looking for, and therefore they couldn't see it. And so that's a really fascinating kind of sort of intellectual project. Is so much of the slave past is a history of absence. It can't be brought back, and part of that's true. It just can't be. But historians in the last 20 years are saying, and archaeologists and cultural anthropologists all working together, like, there's a lot more here that we actually can figure out than we ever thought was possible. So it's in process, essentially. But there's a really great book. I talk about it in my book. I'm forgetting the name of it right now. It's actually controversial. The authors, its co-authors, Hatcher, and the other person's last name I'm forgetting right now, about this very thing in colonial Williamsburg, about the invisible history that was all around them. Hatcher and Gale, maybe? I don't know. So that's a new scholarship used in the last 5 years and through sort of the discoveries. And you're going to see more of this, I think, with the completion of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the Smithsonian. But you're not going to really see it in front of you. The thing with all these great museums, or the Smithsonian in particular, I mean, this is what I know best, the Smithsonian, is that the really great stuff is not on display. I mean, the really head-scratching, controversial, how do we tell the story, don't know how to do it yet stuff is, they have it. We don't know how to tell the story that somebody walking past you can gather up in 5 seconds and keep going. So when that museum opens, they are going to become just, I think, a treasure trove of data about these things. And one of the people who is one of the lead curators for the museum started his career at Williamsburg. And it just had all of this stuff. So the story's unfolding. And I'm very curious to see what's coming next.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, this is just a comment, and maybe you mentioned it because I got here a little bit late, but a librarian at UC Santa Barbara has created a web page that lists all of the websites for African American museums around the country. And it's actually linked on the page that is the live guide for African American studies here for the UCLA. So some of you students may have already seen this, but anyway, I put the link on that because she did a lot of work by going around and finding all these links so that you can get to all of those museums easily and look at their websites. It's like, I don't know if it's all 50 states, but it's a huge number of everything that's there. So there's information that's out there that makes it easy to find without just Googling stuff.
And that's going to be a moving target. One of the concerns many people have, and I share it when the Smithsonian Museum opens, which I support, it's like what happens to the mom and pop museums? And will they be just drained? It's a real concern. But the fact is, the reason I support any of the museum is because like the River Road Museum in Donaldsonville, Louisiana, talk about a shoestring. Those ones running the museum actually have their own checking account, essentially. And when that museum closes, you lost something very valuable. And also, thinking, for those of you who know Louisiana, it's very expensive to preserve material. She doesn't have the budget for it. Her stuff is laminated, which is not the way you preserve material, but the Smithsonian will have the resources. So there's a way in which these large museums are going to be very important. But then you have, so you have these mom and pop museums, and then the museums themselves are very different, whether it's like the River Road Museum, whether it's, museum, I want to say it's in Michigan, I don't think that's right though. It's a museum of the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. That's about the size, I've not visited, I was debating do I need to see it for this book, about the size of this room. That was one man's personal collection that got subsumed by Ferris State, that's the university. And so that's the kind of museum, that's a museum you don't take your child to. Well, that's actually debatable, I guess. And then you have museums like in the Woolworths counter in Greensboro, North Carolina that were built to raise money, absolutely, and made a lot of money at first, and then are just sort of, any money they make is from the school board that they make your children go to these things. So there's all kinds of interesting challenges facing these museums, and not just these, but all museums. And then there was Douglas Wilder, who was on the verge. I didn't hear about it until it was too late. not that I could have done anything, until the story was already written. He had pulled together all these resources. It seemed to have a museum on slavery in Virginia, which was astonishing. And then all the funding collapsed. And it's some sort of, I don't remember the details anymore, but it was a little bit murky. And so a museum on slavery in Virginia, that's a heck of a prospect. And it just, the museums resonate differently in terms of how they deal with subject matter, the scale of the size of their budget, the scale of their ambition, and their geography too. But that's a heck of a statement for your comment, sorry. But it's really, I mean, the museum stuff is fascinating and very complex.
Probably take one last one if there's any.
There's a question over here. Yes.
Yes, just, excuse me, it's just a quick comment and a quick question. Just from the standpoint of the suppression of history and memory, I had the opportunity to go to Alexandria, Louisiana a couple of years ago, where my paternal ancestors are from. And I went to the small museum they have in Louisiana history there. And I think this is one of the, it's not a particularly large city by LA standards, but it's one of the larger cities in Louisiana, I think. And the museum, maybe about twice the size of this room, had fossils from dinosaurs that had been in the area. It had information on the native tribes that had lived there. The one mention of African Americans, of black slaves, anything in the entire museum, was a drawing of 3 slaves playing instruments at a Confederate fundraiser with a gigantic Confederate flag behind them. The only presence of Africans in that entire museum, and it was an absolutely stunning example of the suppression of the history that had gone on.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That actually captures so much of what I was just talking about. I mean, I was in Louisiana for a week doing research, but the rental agent car was like, what did you do? I mean, I put like 750 miles in the car in like 6 days, going to all these different museums. No, I mean, going to, I think, 8 or 9 different museums, from just spectacular, like, wow, this means isn't that money, to museums where you walk in. I mean, the guy, it was quaint in a way that I woke him up when I walked in, and we paid our money, and the museum was sort of like this. It had all this really great history. I'm like, I'm frankly, I was like, where are the black folks? Oh, yeah, I can't even find the black folks. What's going on? And because it was in the Louisiana African American Heritage Trail as a stop, like, where are the black folks? And then as I'm winding over to this other side of the wing, we started going to start showing African villages. I'm like, well, that's interesting. That's not Louisiana history, but African villages. And then the exhibit starts to kind of fall apart almost literally. I mean, the materials were clearly decaying. Then there's a display case that has some shackles, a picture of Obama during the inauguration. Not next to each other. I mean, all in the same place. No, sorry. It was just like this mess of all these different kinds of things, and then an image of that town's sister city in France that was apologizing for the slave trade, its role in the slave trade. I'm like, well, what? I understand. And then I hear the guy at the front desk snoring. I mean, it's like he'd fallen asleep all over again. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, if I'd seen what you saw, I'm like, that would have made sense. The Confederate flag. I mean, just wildly uneven, but really committed to their narratives, and that's probably the most interesting facet of all. They are committed to their narratives, and if you don't get outside that local history and get some other perspective, that's the story you know, and that means we've got a lot of work to do, as in my opinion. Thank you very much.